Welcome. Good morning to those in Asia, good afternoon to those on the West Coast of the United States, and good evening to those in other parts of the country. And I hope that people on the East Coast are all safe and sound after the storm. My name is Margot Landman. I'm Deputy Vice President for Programs at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today two speakers who will address the complexities of the situation in Hong Kong and how Hong Kong fits into PRC Hong Kong relations and PRC US relations. You have their bios, or you can check them out on the National Committee website. But briefly, Christine Lo now divides her time between UCLA, where she is a visiting professor at the Anderson School of Management, and she is there now in LA, and the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology Institute for the Environment. Previously, she served as Undersecretary for the Environment in Hong Kong and as a legislator. She is also the former CEO of the Hong Kong think tank Civic Exchange. After decades serving in the US Foreign Service, Tong joined the Asia Group, leading work in Japan and other parts of East Asia. His final diplomatic post was as Consul General in Hong Kong and Macau. Previously, he served in Washington, Tokyo, and as ambassador for APEC, among other assignments. He was among the architects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement during the Bush and Obama administrations. We look forward to taking audience questions, so please submit your questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. And if you are willing to do so, include your name and affiliation. Before we start with one question each for Christine and Kurt to set the stage, I would like to thank my colleagues at the National Committee. It takes a village to put on a program. In this case, the village extends to our operations and communications teams, as well as to those who work directly on programs. Christine, the first question goes to you. Hong Kong has been through a lot in the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020, from the protests stemming initially from the proposed extradition bill and the district elections, from COVID to the national security law, and from dismissals of legislators to the recent detentions, arrests, and charges against demonstrators and journalists. Could you set the stage for the evening by walking us through some of these developments and describing briefly the context and the significance?
Thank you, Margot. Well, I'll try and do that as briefly as I can. I think the defining moment, or maybe I should say defining moments in the plural in 2019 is of course, the very extended period of protest. And from the protest, I think we can say that the direct cause was the mishandling of the extradition bill by the Hong Kong SAR government. So that's the first defining aspect. Another defining aspect is that despite all these years after the transition from 1997, we still saw a lot of sensitivities amongst ordinary Hong Kong people about its relationship with the mainland. So another defining aspect is that originally the protest, the very large protest, was non-violent, but it did shift to violence. And I think the point of departure has to do with the continuing violence over the months. And I know one of the discussions that we will have today is about the national security law. And the national security law is an outgrowth of the violent, the violence during this long protest period. If I can just also press this point about the narratives that have arisen from this period of moments. So the kind of narratives that has come out of the switch from non-violent to violent is police brutality. How were protesters treated? Now, of course, there's the counter narrative as well to these narratives. One of the counter narratives is actually the Hong Kong police had to deal with a lot of violence. And in terms of death and injuries, actually, it was very low. You know, if one were to take other types of similar large-scale protests from around the world. Then we had another narratives of external forces interference. And this might be something that participants would want to discuss, but what I'm saying is this is one of the narratives that has come forth. Another narrative is one of deep polarization in Hong Kong, the yellow and the blue, let's call this the yellow and the blue narratives. And from there, the arguments has been, well, because of the brutality, because of fear of China, somehow the ends justifies the means in terms of the extensive violence. And, you know, there's the Lam Tao, there's the Be Water narratives. So all of these narratives were mixing into how we were looking at Hong Kong. And then, of course, one of the narratives during this period and even coming to today is, well, how are we going to pull back from the brink? And in past discussions I've had with yourselves, we've talked about, well, when is it the right time to have some kind of dialogue amongst the polarizing forces? And is there a moment for moderation? So let me leave that for now and go back to the point of departure in terms of from non-violence to violence. Now, this has led to a different narrative coming from around the world about what's happening to Hong Kong, you know, the high level of autonomy that Hong Kong is supposed to enjoy, derived from the Basic Law and the relationship of the joint declaration. What does the joint declaration between Britain and China really means today? So I think there's a whole discussion there, and that obviously leads to a discussion about what's the degree of freedom that Hong Kong people still have. Then, Margot, as you said, the context of the protest also took place within the geopolitical shifts in US-China relations. So people also talk about Hong Kong being collateral damage when giants are having a punch-up. Then we talk about sanctions. Are sanctions useful? And you know, we now have a whole discussion about what the US and UK and other Western governments might do in terms of giving more passports to Hong Kong people and visas and so on. And then, of course, a very current discussion is, well, if sanctions don't work, what might the Biden administration do? Will the Biden administration be able to pull everything back from the brink, so to speak? And finally, I do want to say that COVID, I mean, you know, we can't have any discussion today about virtually anything without mentioning COVID. So what's the situation in Hong Kong? I mean, Hong Kong is not so dissimilar from many other places. You know, economic activities have been affected. Jobs is a problem. Then, of course, we are part of China. We're on the periphery of China. China has now said that going forward, it's going to practice a kind of due circulation in terms of its economic focus. What does this mean? Hong Kong, they have said, well, you know, this is a part of China. We're not going to let Hong Kong go down. Hong Kong could be integrated more fully into the southern part of the economy, what we call the Greater Bay Area. So these are some of the issues all happening between 2019 and today. Now, permit me just to end by saying a little summary. How Hong Kong people feel, I think today is, you know, a lot of things are unsettled. They're also unsettling because the national security law is a new experience for Hong Kong. And how will that be defined over time? And our politics, if we're looking at whether you're talking about the pro-establishment camp or the pro-democracy camp, local politics is broken today. So, how does one go forward with the very difficult local political situation? Because my personal view is actually Hong Kong's problem's got to be solved by people in Hong Kong. We've got to have some rules of engagement, maybe some new rules of engagement with Beijing, because they do call the shots. They are the sovereign power. So as I said, my own personal view has always been that Hong Kong being a part of China, that we do want the basic law to work. We do want a high degree of autonomy. We do want rule of law. We do want our freedoms. But in order to protect and expand and to have that in Hong Kong, we cannot ignore Beijing. We cannot be seen as an enemy of Beijing. So perhaps I could just end here.
Okay, thank you very much. Lots to chew on there. But before we chew, Kurt, you were Consul General in Hong Kong from summer 2016 to summer 2019, spanning the end of the Obama administration and more than 2 years of the Trump administration. With all that Christine just described as background and foreground, please tell us about interactions with the Hong Kong government and Hong Kong people during the years that you were representing the US government there, and how they changed over time in the context of US-Hong Kong relations and US-China relations.
Yeah, let me back into an actual answer to your question, Margot, by giving an overall framing of what I saw as the U.S. objectives in Hong Kong and our main diplomatic tactical approaches to achieving those objectives throughout my tour, actually, from 2016 all the way until the summer 2019. I left 3 days after the young people broke into the Legislative Council and desecrated the meeting room there. If you take a step back from the whole picture, Hong Kong is part of China, a very different part of China, with a different culture, different sets of laws, different social norms, different expectations about how life should be conducted, about what rights individuals have and should be able to exercise. Very different. Okay, you can go on and on and on about the differences, the residual differences between Hong Kong and the rest of China. That's sort of fact on the ground, number one. Fact number two was that people of Hong Kong liked that, and regardless of whether they were pro-establishment or pan-democratic or localist in nature, people liked being different from the rest of China. So that's Hong Kong. From the international perspective, the value of Hong Kong derived primarily from the differences rather than the fact that it was part of China. So the international community, both officially and unofficially and in everything they did, was never questioning the idea that Hong Kong was part of China, but rather that it was a better Hong Kong was a different Hong Kong. And because it's useful, frankly, to the international community as a place to do business, a place to conduct research, academics, more pleasant place to visit, consistent with Western values in terms of how it's organized and how it runs, et cetera. And therefore also an extraordinarily useful bridge for doing business of all kinds, profit and nonprofit, with bigger China, the rest of China. And the formulation that Deng Xiaoping established was different is good, right? One country, two systems. Now, he was very clear that it's got to be one country, and he didn't want anyone questioning that. And the international community never questioned it. And a handful Hong Kongers ultimately started to say that they questioned it as sort of more of a tactic than a sincere belief that that was ever possible. But the operating assumption within China was different is good. So as China grew, and Hong Kong grew too, but not as much, and as China became stronger and Hong Kong was strong, but not as much, China started to look at the cost benefit equation of Hong Kong being different from a different perspective over time. The irritating parts of Hong Kong, freedom of speech. What's that? We don't like that. That's bad. Freedom of movement, the calls for democracy, people thumbing their nose at Beijing, all of that drives people in Beijing bananas. The part that they liked was, well, the world's #3 financial center, operating at great efficiency, bringing capital in and out of China, and contributing to Chinese economic growth, a pleasant place to visit, a sign from China that it was tolerant of international ways of doing business, even on Chinese turf to some extent. And that cost-benefit equation was shifting gradually over time. And what I think Christine was describing was a more dramatic shift in that balance from Beijing's perspective, starting in 2019. But it was shifting already. So to that question, I felt, as did all of my colleagues from other consulates and people in the international community in general in Hong Kong, that we were kind of sliding down a slope towards less autonomy, and that the goal was to slow that down, right? That was kind of the goal. So I brought my prop this evening. For those of you that read Chinese characters, the US loves Hong Kong, right? So I arrived in 2016, and the goal was to, in positive terms, express what was good about Hong Kong, why the international community liked that, and why China should like it too. It's great. Hong Kong's wonderful, super. It's different. Different is good. Two systems is just as important as one country, but we realize that you think that one country is more important. That's okay. We like two systems. We need two systems is good. Two systems is good. Two systems is good. Constantly repeating that, and why that was good, and why we were comfortable with Chinese management of that arrangement as long as they kept the promises. Enter increased friction, the polarization of Hong Kong politics that Christine was describing, and the changes in the cost-benefit equation, and this started to fall apart quicker and quicker, and then events started to create themselves with, the dramatic mishandling of the extradition situation, fostering demonstrations changing Beijing's calculus. The one perhaps and an increasing feeling like we were kind of, the US is essentially powerless in Hong Kong to change the fate of the city, right? The key decisions are made in Beijing. And I would contest a little bit the idea that Beijing's clampdown and elimination of freedoms subsequent to 2019 was inevitable, because other societies react to social unrest in other ways than changing the law and essentially creating a system of gathering of political prisoners. That is unfortunate, not surprising, and now has a lot of momentum, and dealing with it is going to be extraordinarily difficult, and perhaps maybe not be possible. But the main point is that the decision, if things are going to get better, they're going to get better because Beijing wants them to get better. Better defined as different, as high degree of autonomy, as separate from China in terms of how things are managed. So that's kind of how I felt, and it's disconcerting how it all ended up.
Thank you, Kurt. Christine, do you want to respond to anything that Kurt just said, or should we go on to questions from the audience?
I think I would just say that perhaps I'd like to think that what Kurt has shared with us, that the US love Hong Kong, the strategy that he shared with us in terms of when he arrived in Hong Kong, that was the strategy. I thought was interesting because does that give us the seed of how US-China relations could go forward again? So that's point number one. Point number two was he said that he also didn't, and forgive me if I didn't understand Kurt properly. I thought what I heard was that there were maybe fairly limited number of people who were really independence advocate, and that they were doing this more as a tactic than something that they truly believed in. Now, I'd like to think that that is true, and I think therefore it would be very important again to be much more explicit that secession is not it's not the way forward. Now, how one blends this into a discussion about freedom of expression, perhaps I can leave that till later.
Kurt, any response to that?
Well, one of the, there's a lot of episodes in my experience, and I try to remember things clearly. Sometimes it's a bit of a blur, but one of the days I remember was when President Xi came to Hong Kong in the summer of 2017 and gave a very important speech, which I had the opportunity to listen to at that big convention center, and he seemed to say that he had a red line policy for Hong Kong, and that certain activities, and this was how it was also then spun out by the liaison office in terms of how it was explained to everybody, that certain activities were unacceptable, and the Hong Kong government would be tasked with trying to eliminate them. Difficult to do, given that at the time, without the national security law, some of these things are difficult to prosecute. So, but he was pretty clear that he didn't want to hear people saying secession. And as a result, what I was hearing was that the vast majority of the pan-democratic crowd, including localists, people who were running for legislative council and whatnot, were very careful not to use the independence word. Now, they said stuff that was offensive to Beijing, but not crossing that particular line, or they were trying to be careful not to cross that particular line. And that's sort of where things were on the outside of the envelope, and the fine edge was in that area. I got taken to task by the Hong Kong government when I went on TV and was asked the question, the journalist, always gets you in trouble, saying, is it okay for people to advocate independence? And I said, well, in the United States, it's okay. So that's my answer. And I got in trouble for that. Like, I got smacked on the wrist, like, can't say that. And I said, okay, I'll tone it down. But the point being that was the edge of the envelope, and then somehow the extradition thing just helped things get out of hand, and you had some increasing numbers of people saying, really going out of their way to antagonize Beijing in the course of those protests, which was unfortunate. And the more moderate Democrats were trying to tone it down, but were unsuccessful. I still don't think that justifies the national security law. And so we should get into a discussion about what the options are going forward. I'm not sure there are that many.
We've got quite a few questions about the effectiveness of US policy. And I think both of you have said in different ways that there's really not much the US can do. But let me read some of these questions. I'm grouping them together in the interests of time because we've got quite a number of questions coming in. The first one comes from Nelson Dong of Dorsey and Whitney, who is director of the National Committee. Various US sanctions have publicly targeted Hong Kong SAR officials. Could you comment on the effectiveness and impact of those types of US sanctions to alter laws or policies and to promote the rule of law? From Roy Sheldon of the China Business Associates. Recognizing the history of unequal treaties signed during the Qing dynasty, Hong Kong's colonial past and China's ascent onto the world stage as an economic, political, and military powerhouse since 1997, what leverage do the British and the global community realistically have on Beijing for the remaining 27 years of the joint declaration? And as the return of Taiwan is the last remaining goal of Beijing, what is a supportable strategy for the US, Taiwan, and its allies to maintain peace while trying to influence the current political situation in Hong Kong? And just two more. What other effective policies or levers could or might the Biden team offer, except for the current symbolic sanctions on 14 deputy chairpersons in Beijing? That's from Jin Sun Graduate Institute in Geneva. And from Frank Wong at Scholastics, has the US gone overboard in its Hong Kong sanctions relative to the gross murder of the journalist by the Saudi authorities? That's probably a little bit too far askew for us. Should we start with you, Kurt?
Sure. So the policy options for any foreign country in this situation are limited, right? And I do think the main decision points reside in Beijing. And so as I was describing earlier, the attempt was to appeal to China's better angels, if you will, that it was in their interest to maintain a high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong, and that would result in good benefits for China. That's positive leverage, right? So none of the questions talked about the execution of positive leverage as opposed to negative leverage. I still think there's a role for positive leverage. It's not being talked about in Washington in the current context. I was one of maybe 2.5 people in all of Washington who thought that the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act last fall was a bad idea, and that the U.S. should be really careful about putting itself in a box of making the Hong Kong Policy Act work in negative fashion as well as in positive fashion. So just to review, the Hong Kong Policy Act, the US is the only country, to my knowledge, that had a specific act specifically authorizing the US to treat Hong Kong differently than the rest of China for purposes of its law, US law. That was a good thing, and it allowed. Now the US is kind of hyper legal country, and that's probably why we did it, but it provided a framework that the idea was to treat Hong Kong as much as possible separately to reinforce the autonomy muscles that the Hong Kong government and society could utilize. So positive leverage. The problem was that in that legislation, we also said, well, if it starts to lose autonomy, then the US should do something about it in terms of how it treats Hong Kong. And that was a mistake in retrospect. And other countries didn't get themselves into that box. And it led to the US then in this year, as the national security law was implemented, and by any measure, Hong Kong lost a lot of autonomy due to the imposition of that law. Doesn't mean it has none, but the US now has gotten itself boxed into like a binary decision of saying one or the other. It either has autonomy or doesn't have autonomy. Okay, well, we're going to decide it doesn't have autonomy and act thusly. What what I'd like to see is some revival of the idea that positive leverage has a role here, and that in the areas that Hong Kong exercises autonomy, the U.S. will treat it with as if it has that autonomy, or because it does, and get back into a little bit of a trying to rebuild these ideas of Hong Kong having a degree of autonomy. Now, things like the national security law, very difficult now that Beijing's locked into that. I honestly can't think of a form of leverage that is not self-destructive for the United States that could possibly get China to reverse that law. And that's an unfortunate state of affairs. The negative leverages that all the questions were asking, sanctions is one of them. The treating Hong Kong the same as China, the normalization policy that the Trump administration has used, is another one. They similarly have very little effect, because the cost for Hong Kong or China is low. And on the distancing question, the cost is all on Hong Kong. It's not on China. And the normalization policies all fall on Hong Kong's shoulders. And then the other question is, then do you take it to the next level and really try to just like punish China over Hong Kong? And bits of the Hong Kong Autonomy Act hint at that, by introducing the idea of bank sanctions, specifically over Hong Kong. The problem is all of that is self-destructive for the United States. It's all lose-lose type activities, because if you make Hong Kong worse and make it suffer, it's bad for the United States. So it's a box, it's a pickle. No like really silver bullet type ways out of it that I can see.
Christine?
Yeah, I think the word is collateral damage, right? Sitting in Hong Kong, if you're looking at it from whether it serves Hong Kong's interest, I think all the sanctions and whatnot that has come out of the current US administration has not been good for Hong Kong. The other thing that has not been helpful, and indeed this is something that I think really gets up Beijing's nose, is that we've had Hong Kong political figures running to Washington, calling for sanctions to punish Hong Kong and Chinese officials, including giving a list of names of Hong Kong officials that should be sanctioned and punished. So what I'm saying is, this kind of activity is also one of those things that perhaps the US has never experienced. But I think if you're sitting up in Beijing, this is something that is much more than an irritant. And it's much more than a silly little tactic, maybe from some young people. So I think it also requires Hong Kong to think more deeply, because going forward, we will have politics in Hong Kong. We will have to deal with our own discussions about how to further democracy, for example, and how do we then deal with Beijing? So I think some of the things that actually happen in 2019 has been very damaging. And I think it's not enough just to say, well, it's too bad we have the national security law. Well, we have to live it. And the notion that the US has stepped in with these sanctions and so on, what has that really done? That has made Beijing dig its heels in. And I think we all can agree that it's not going to step back. Now, to think kind of more positively, this notion of positive versus negative leverage, I do see some signs, nevertheless, that Beijing is prepared to kind of have a new relationship with a new government in the US. Now, Hong Kong might not be the first thing on its mind, but over the course of the next year, what are some of the areas where US and China can start some meaningful dialogue, start to come to some new rules of engagement amongst themselves. And I think and I think actually many other countries and certainly business and so on are very keen to see a more positive relationship between US and China. I mean, we've already heard from all these countries in ASEAN, for example, basically saying, please don't force us to take sides. So I think with the new administration, how will that, I mean, I have no basis for making too many guesses, but I think, Kurt, you're the expert here. What is it that is possible?
Kurt, what's possible?
Well, I think there's going to be a lot of exploration of some different approaches to China. The fundamental, I mean, just talking about, our topic today is Hong Kong, and unfortunately, when you start talking about the broader context of U.S.-China relations, Hong Kong drops down to priority number somewhere down the list from the perspective of U.S. national interest, which is what the U.S. government is going to pursue. And what that means is that there is not so much opportunity for cross-linkage. For example, the U.S. saying, well, we'll do this on trade if you stop arresting people in Hong Kong, or something like that. That kind of thing just won't work. For one thing, Beijing would consider that offensive and an interference in internal affairs of China, et cetera. And it also would mean giving up something that's, perhaps a more important prerogative or priority for the United States in pursuing its interests vis-a-vis China. So I'm not coming up with a clear way that, frankly, a different approach from the Biden administration with respect to China is immediately going to lead to things improving with respect to Beijing's policy on Hong Kong. Unfortunately, I don't actually expect that to transpire. Just being honest here, I do think that what the Biden administration, the main difference in its China policy will be the degree of coherence and the degree to which it makes common cause with other countries, not against China per se, but against specific aspects of Chinese policy in the international sphere that the US and other countries object to. And so I would expect to see a lot of attempts to make common cause with like-minded countries in dealing with issues like technology diversion and theft, state-owned enterprise participation in the international economy, China's approach to infrastructure lending, et cetera. And then, of course, the strategic and military issues. And that will be the fundamental change. More teamwork and a calmer, perhaps more rational approach to trying to set up the possibility of some win-win negotiations between the US and China that are broader in scope than just the trade piece that the Trump administration concentrated on. Where Hong Kong fits into that, I don't know. I would love to see China say, just from its own interests, that they're going to slow down and kind of dial back on the current campaign in Hong Kong that feels a little bit like a strike hard campaign to defang all political opposition in Hong Kong, and just dial it back, because they've done enough, right? They got most of the leaders have either fled the city or are in jail, and rounding up the rest of them isn't going to accomplish anything other than create a constant irritation and anxiety among people in Hong Kong. So maybe they might dial it back, but I'm not optimistic as of today.
Right, I do want to come in here, and because very much of what Kurt said I agree with, but it does mean that the sanctions that have been put out there, and a lot of the narratives by some of the most senior officials in the US about Hong Kong has actually been fairly damaging and hasn't actually helped to assist Hong Kong to be able to do, I think, what Kurt had explained to us at the start of our discussion, which is to support autonomy. So I think that's one of my conclusions. The second one is dialing back. There has been a small gem of hope in Carrie Lam's, her policy address, where for those people who had played a minor role in the protest, that it is possible to show some kind of clemency. But the issue, again, about not pursuing them too hard is that the crimes that has been committed, that the fact that they did something wrong also has to be acknowledged. So I think there is a space there, you know, how that's going to be, how that's going to be organized. I think we have to wait and see. But I do see a glimmer of hope there for possibly many of those who've been arrested or even charged for lesser crimes.
Continuing with the Hong Kong itself as opposed to US policy theme, we've got a couple of questions pointing out that one country, two systems was meant only to last for 50 years. And this version of the question comes from somebody named James. He didn't include his last name. Therefore, eventually the objective was to fully integrate Hong Kong back into China by 2047. The changes in Hong Kong since 97 have to soft integration of the Hong Kong population to accept China's ideology. However, much of the protest against China was led by the generation that grew up after 97. Is there a sense of failure from China that they have not been able to influence the Hong Kong populace? And a related question, not so much the 50 years, but from Joe Batat, formerly of the World Bank, now with MIT, how much have economic factors played into the recent events in Hong Kong, such as access to affordable housing, adequate living wages, and so on?
I certainly think there is a lot of social economic discontent in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has some of the issues that I think you also see in the US and elsewhere, which is that for half a generation, the real income of people have not increased, whilst cost has increased. A lot of people have made a lot of money. Rich people got richer, and actually some of the social justice issue has not been addressed. So I think if you were a young person in Hong Kong, you might say, well, you know, really, what is my future? So I think that's number one. The number two is the threat to identity, the feeling that our way of life, you know, Kurt described this as, you know, Hong Kong is different. We have our different way of life, and we really treasure and love that. And are we losing that? And are we becoming mainlandized, so to speak? But somehow we haven't been able to have the kind of more constructive political discussion about our fears, to what extent these fears are justified. Now, of course, the other thing is there are changes on the mainland as well, as Kurt also reminds us. The usefulness of Hong Kong is no longer as absolute as it used to be. And I think there's a lot of concern in Hong Kong that somehow the mainland's advance has just been so awesome. So that creates a sense in ordinary Hong Kong people about whether they can keep up. So I think that's one. The other one is we also see the failure of our local politics. So, you know, the democracy campaigns, that has always been seen by Hong Kong people as one way of asserting our identity. But nevertheless, we haven't got it, and young people use that as kind of a badge of why they're surging forward. Now, of course, I think even the Democrats did make some very serious mistakes. In 2014, 2015, Beijing, under the current leadership, was willing to put something on the table where after there is a kind of nomination process, 2 or 3 people could be elected as chief executive. And for the Democrats, the Pan Democrats, including a lot of new young people who were coming forward, this simply wasn't good enough. They want a no holds bar kind of electoral process. And in the end, of course, that actually quite generous proposal was rejected. I must say I was very, very concerned and upset at the time, because if you looked at it historically, I mean, if you looked at the Chinese Communist Party, this was the most democratic thing that they were willing to allow a significant part of the country to go ahead with. And we decided in Hong Kong, the Democrats said, no, we don't want it. This is just not good enough. So I think we also need to think about that, going forward. If we want electoral reform, then how do we go about reviving this discussion with Beijing?
A few follow-up, very more specific questions related to that from Virginia Harper Ho at the University of Kansas Law School. What are the prospects for a continued free press and independent judiciary in Hong Kong, given the patriotism requirements already applied to the legislature? And from Robert Keatley, former SCMP, South China Morning Post editor, is there any possibility that real autonomy can be restored, or is it gone forever?
Of course. The notion of patriotism actually is really important. When I was growing up in Hong Kong, I don't remember anyone ever asking me to sing God Save the Queen. Throughout my time in going to school in Hong Kong, and then I went to school in England, the British themselves are not very demonstrative in terms of the symbols of their patriotism. So I think for Hong Kong people, the notion of the symbol of state, which actually is very important in China, is very important to Beijing. We have a very low appreciation of how upsetting it is. For example, I mean, people would remember for some years before 2019 that whenever China, this was in soccer, whenever China was playing another jurisdiction, that the national anthem was played, and people would boo and actually do terribly disrespectful things. And then I think also in Hong Kong in 2019, the damaging, the destruction of the national anthem, the flags, and all of those things, I think to Beijing and to mainlanders are very upsetting. And if we were to do a kind of comparison to the US, taking the knee, right, for a lot of athletes, taking the knee appears, when you juxtapose it to what Hong Kong people were doing with our national symbols, was very gentle. So I think, again, it does require us to think about patriotism. If we accept that China is the sovereign power, can we at least be very respectful of the national symbols? Now, there's a whole discussion in Hong Kong today about the government asking civil servants to do a pledge of loyalty. Now, this is symbolic, and are you willing even to do that? And we mustn't forget that a number of legislators, in terms of swearing their oath of office, and some of them were disqualified. And actually, if you watched actually what they were doing, you kind of think, well, actually, you probably could be disqualified in other jurisdictions' legislature as well, because everybody has to kind of take some kind of an oath of office. So I think this lack of appreciation amongst ordinary Hong Kong people, because we hadn't been asked to do some of these things before. What does patriotism mean? I mean, this is actually a good topic of conversation in Hong Kong itself. And the other question from Robert Keatley about real autonomy, well, I think autonomy is a high degree of autonomy. Beijing would say that we never said you are fully autonomous. And the autonomy, if we were to look at the basic law, this is what spells out the autonomy, not the joint declaration, but the basic law. And the basic law always had Article 23 there. The Article 23 is Hong Kong, you guys have got to go and pass your own laws, but we're very clear about what those things are going to be. So that's subversion, collusion, and secession, and a number of other thing. So we never managed to pass our law, and trying to say, well, you know, you never did it, I'm going to now give it to you in the national security law. So I think if you were looking, I think one of the things that Hong Kong people have to do, however difficult it is to be willing to look at the narrative from Beijing's side, and then to see, well, is there some dialogue that we can have in order to really maintain this autonomy that is so valuable that, you know, even up in Beijing, they acknowledge we want one country, two systems to succeed. And I think the US, you know, according to what Kurt has shared with us, well, this is what everybody wants, that there is this space in Hong Kong that serves everybody's interest. And China has now put a big red line across it. Yes, but not in these areas. So this is what, I mean, I think Hong Kong, we need to take this on and develop a narrative, new rules of engagement with Beijing. But possibly this very moment, I don't know whether we're ready for that or not.
Kurt, anything to add?
Sure. If I could go back to just briefly to the 50-year thing, and then I've got something to add on this question. The Sino-British Joint Declaration Basic Law does not say that the 50-year period is a time for the frogs to be quietly boiled in sort of Communist Party philosophy sauce until they like it at the end. It actually said high degree of autonomy for 50 years minimum. So that wasn't the intention of maybe it was a secret intention of Deng Xiaoping, but it wasn't his stated intention, and it's certainly not what Britain and Hong Kong signed up for. So I think it's important to try and somehow establish a sense of either things not getting worse or reestablish a sense of positive momentum. Because a lot of what Christine said, I'd really agree with, and a lot of it is, where do you draw the line? How much autonomy can Hong Kong expect and hope for, and how can it get it, and which forms of autonomy really matter? Because Beijing is more than happy to give Hong Kong significant economic policy autonomy, even now. Now there's hints of like Hong Kong not being so valuable. Like, I was quite disappointed when Xi Jinping visited Shenzhen, and he spoke about, when he was talking about the Greater Bay Area, it was mostly about Shenzhen, not about Hong Kong. And it was, Hong Kong was like this city that might help Shenzhen grow, and that would be nice. As opposed to Hong Kong as this example of an alternative form of economic organization, which is really valuable to China. And maybe the Greater Bay Area should be adopting some of those norms that are existent in Hong Kong in Guangdong, which I think was what Hong Kongers are hoping for from the whole Greater Bay Area concept. But the going back to my point, Beijing's happy to give Hong Kong economic autonomy, not really happy about the whole idea of political autonomy. The problem is when it starts to leak in from one to the other. And so the question about independent judiciary and about freedom of expression, freedom of media are really important questions. The whole, because there are some key concepts that it's important for Hong Kong to defend, even in order to maintain a strong economic system, which is still universally recognized as good for China, good for the international community, good for Hong Kong. And included in those are the freedom of expression, freedom of the media, because if that starts to get chiseled away at, it will impact how the economy works and make it less strong and less competitive, make Hong Kong less competitive as a place to do business. Similarly with the independent judiciary. So with the national security law, Hong Kong now has, in essence, two different bodies of law which are not consistent about freedom of expression and about political activity. And on one side, there's very vague law that says that foreign collusion and other things are forbidden. But then there's another body of law that says you have freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of opinion, etc. And having inconsistent laws is a recipe, and then two different legal systems where you got some judges that are appointed in one way and some judges appointed another. It's not a disaster yet, but it's a recipe that's dangerous, and you could see some creep into the independent judiciary. And there have been really unfortunate statements by some mainland officials calling into question the value of an independent judiciary. It doesn't surprise me to have no Chinese official ever say that a loyal opposition is a good thing, right? Because that's not part of the Chinese political system, right? Loyal opposition means that's not good. But it's really unfortunate to the degree that Beijing starts pushing on the judiciary, pushing on media, because that's going to really impact the utility of Hong Kong as a place to do business over time, gradually, but maybe faster than people might think.
We have an interesting question from Andy Juncker of the Yale China Association Hong Kong office. After the repression of protests in 1989, the political mood among people in China was bleak. Then the economic takeoff occurred, and the changes secured widespread pride and consent in the Chinese model. Is there any way for Beijing to repeat this by breaking Hong Kong's economic impasses around housing and inequality? Is this feat possible? And if so, how is Beijing attempting this? Christine, you want to take?
Can I jump in on that one first? That's what I thought Carrie was going to do as chief executive, that she was going to come in with a lot of energy on social welfare issues because of these big, profound economic gaps. I mean, it's a city where people in Maseratis drive down the same street as people pushing carts, collecting boxes, right? The economic disparities are pronounced, and there's a severe housing shortage and some real cost of living issues. I was, as an employer in Hong Kong, distraught by the fact that because we based our wages at the consulate on benchmarks in Hong Kong, white collar workers had not gotten a pay raise for like a decade, right? So those are the issues that she campaigned on, and was hoping that we'd see a lot of that. There was a lot of resistance around NIMBYism and questions about environment and due process and all that sort of stuff about landfill and whatnot. But I was hoping that would be the agenda, and instead it became this extradition bill. Again, a really huge mistake, and that's kind of unfortunate. But going forward, the actual question was, is that an appropriate agenda? Absolutely. And seeing the Hong Kong government with support from Beijing actually addressing some of those key development issues in Hong Kong society would be, I think, reassuring, especially if it's done with input from people, not sort of just written by the government and then imposed on everybody.
Christine, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the good thing about politics is we can change. We can change overnight. And many people can play some role in that. Now, whether it's possible to enter that magic moment. I mean, that's the billion-dollar question. What I'm saying is all kinds of political problems can benefit from taking a new view. Now, up in Beijing, how can we engage them to have a more positive discussion at a time when they have perhaps many concerns about the geopolitical situation? Secondly, that in Hong Kong, with our local politics having broken down, the different components, whether they're pro-establishment, there's a new party, Bauhinia Party, that has just been formed. You've got the pro-democracy camp. The problem is, I think the pro-democracy camp hasn't had a strategy for a long time. So what I'm saying is all these potential players, what is it that they could be contributing to creating a new moment? I think the opportunities are there, and then solving problems. Now, we might have to conclude that the current administration may have done as much as it could. And, the current administration has a finite life, and it is actually coming to the tail end of that. And I think if we were to take what Mrs. Lam said, well, what she wants to do is to deal with the post-COVID economic situation. And there will be a lot to do in 2021. And then there will be a change of government. So one of the challenges, frankly, also from Beijing is, well, who's going to be the next person that will lead Hong Kong? How will these problems be resolved? And actually, Kurt mentioned the visit of Xi Jinping to Hong Kong. That was for the 20th celebration in 2017. And he said, and actually other senior Chinese officials have been saying for a number of years, that Hong Kong needs to to solve the problems that it has. I mean, high land prices, jobs, and so on. So I think these problems that we have, these social economic problems that we have, are well known to Beijing. And Beijing has even kind of, I think, said things to the property tycoons in Hong Kong. Well, you guys have to contribute to this. But exactly what you do, what kind of policies you have, how you bring people together to have those conversations, to build consensus, that has to be done in Hong Kong by the Hong Kong administration. And I think if we were honest, we have to say, well, that hasn't been done very well. So, that magic moment that might come, how can we catch it? What contributions can Beijing make? If Beijing's concern about people stirring for secession and whatnot in Hong Kong is going to ease off, that US-China relations could be better, then I think maybe there will be a moment where Hong Kong itself could look and have new rules of engagement, which Hong Kong will have to lead and have discussions with Beijing.
We have a question talking about 2017 from David Zweig, formerly your colleague, more or less, Christine, at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. It's addressed to Kurt, and it's a two-part question. How do you respond to surveys that showed that by 2017, 40% of people under 40 hoped that Hong Kong would be independent after 2047? And second, didn't the US Congress essentially interfere in China's internal affairs when it introduced the Hong Kong Freedom and Democracy Act?
So if the surveys were accurate, and who knows whether they were, that shows what people hoped. If you phrased it expected, I think you'd probably get a different answer. So that's reality. I mean, I think a lot of people in Hong Kong would like to be part of like Belgium or something, but that's not the way it is. If you live in Hong Kong, you're in China. And I think, just the vast majority of people in Hong Kong know that that's a fact. And then whether they say they accept it or not, or that's what they would hope for, or that's what they want, that's where the tolerance thing comes in. And I, you know, I realize from an emotional level for Beijing, people saying, it's like, you know, in the United States, people hearing that such and such people think that the US is terrible and they'd rather not live there. They think that US, you know, that they should, you know, California should be a separate state or something like that. That's offensive to a lot of people. But everyone just kind of shrugged their shoulders and say, you know, well, that's not going to happen. Texas gave up being a country, you know, 150 years ago. It's not going to happen. So that's kind of a flippant answer, but David's second question was on
the Hong Kong, the Security Act. Did Congress interfere in China's domestic affairs? Not the Security Act, the Freedom and Democracy Act.
Maybe. So what? Does that matter? I mean, China interferes in U.S. domestic affairs on a daily basis, right?
Explicitly?
Explicitly? No, that's not their stated policy. It's not the stated policy of the United States to interfere in China's domestic affairs. It's the stated policy of the U.S. They wrote a policy act saying that autonomy is good and the U.S. is going to support that. If autonomy goes away, we're going to take action because it's a broken promise.
David was referring to the Hong Kong Freedom and Democracy Act.
Correct, which that act says that the U.S. would take action as, or could take action as punishment if China breaks its promises over Hong Kong. So is that interference in China's internal affairs? Maybe, I don't know. But does that matter, David? Sorry, I mean, and that's a Chinese line that if anything that happens inside China's borders, the rest of the world can't comment on it because it's China, and that just doesn't work. That's not how the planet, we're all on this one big planet. We get to talk about each other all the time.
Okay, we have a question from Sheldon Pang, who's also a National Committee director. He says, to me, a turning point in Hong Kong people's sentiment towards the mainland is when the annual candlelight vigil for Tiananmen lost many followers. Do you think it's because people no longer identify themselves as Chinese and therefore do not care as much anymore, or they just started to give up as time has elapsed? Christine, why don't you tackle that one?
Yeah, you know, I think that was a surprise to many of us at maybe you could call us the 89 generation, because for many of us who are older, 1989 was a defining moment. But the younger people, the teenagers and those in, you know, around 20, they were the people. This is the sort of the rise of the new political consciousness of younger people in Hong Kong. I mean, they were the ones who were saying, well, we don't need to associate with any of that. That's not our thing. So what does that show us? I think that shows us a huge disconnect between the younger people and perhaps our modern history. And that modern history is the modern history of China. And I think, again, for people like me and my generation, and definitely my father's generation, you know, my father left Shanghai to come to Hong Kong, and he eventually moved on to the US, became an American citizen. But he always wished China well. And, you know, you could say that there was a lot of reservation about the Communist Party, what happened over the years during Communist Party rules in the 50s and the 60s and so on. But I always felt that he wanted China to do better. You know, that was, he never felt he was not Chinese. And, you know, even though he became an American citizen, but, you know, China, we want China to do better. And that's sort of how I feel. How can I contribute to China's development and modernization? But there is a disconnect with the young people. And I think we're dealing probably with quite complex feelings, how they see themselves, how they see Hong Kong, how they see China. And as a teacher who've given some lectures at HKUST, I've also talked to some young Hong Kong people where I'll give you one example, and this was quite shocking to me. I gave a lecture on the environment. So this was really about how China might deal with carbon neutrality, the work that China has already done in recent years in dealing with the environment, which are quite positive. And after the class, a young Hong Kong person said to me, well, how is it possible for China to do well? You know, how are they going to do all these things in the environment when Chinese officials are corrupt and incompetent? You know, and I know. So, but anyway, it was important to have a discussion. And of course, you know, the feeling from the young person, you know, why did you have this feeling? I think is exactly the kind of discussion we need to have in Hong Kong. You know, I'm not implying in any way that the young person that I happen to be interacting with is stupid or ignorant. But what I'm saying is there is a huge gap of just knowledge and interest in the mainland. And how can we deal with that in Hong Kong?
I think we have time for one more question. I'd like to give it to Minky Warden of Human Rights Watch. She writes, Kurt, thank you for your strong defense of Hong Kong when you were in the Consul General's seat. Christine, thank you for your decades of building civil society and awareness of human rights in Hong Kong. Many of Hong Kong's young leaders, including Joshua Wong and Agnes Chow, have gone to prison for long jail terms under harsh prosecutions that previously would have gotten 200 hours of public service. What can the international community do to encourage clemency and reduced sentences for the young people whose main quote unquote crime was advocating for the democracy contained in the 1984 Joint Declaration?
Well, I think first of all is I think there'll be a lot of dispute in Hong Kong about whether all the young people who were protesting in 2019 that their main thing was pursuing democracy because of the level of destruction. And I think this is one key concern that I have, that the pro-democracy movement, particularly of the younger people, has it really become an anti-China movement? Now, if this is just a tactic, that's one thing. But I think if they really want to pursue electoral reform and democracy in Hong Kong, I'd like to see them be much more thoughtful about how to do it. And now we have the national security law, and there's one line of discussion in Hong Kong that also says, well, we have the national security law, and the way that it is written, what it prohibits was actually drafted by the protesters. You know, all the things that China didn't want to see, well, all of those things are now in the national security law. So I think we need to be careful about the pro and the anti narrative in Hong Kong. And you know, the level of violence and destruction for a very long time was very great. Was it really about democracy? Or did it lose its way somewhere and just became an outpouring of violence? So I think that's one of the key narratives and discussion we are going to have to sort out in Hong Kong. And that is being played out in the courts, unfortunately. Now, as I said earlier on, the issue of clemency, we have seen now the chief executive in her policy address kind of raised this issue. But again, let me repeat what I said earlier on. The issue about clemency is that I think you have to acknowledge that you did something wrong and you ain't going to do it again. So I think for people who really have very light, very light crimes, can clemency be shown with those? And I think that's what Mrs. Lam was saying. But for those who committed more serious crimes, I think be very difficult just to say, well, let's just forget all about that.
Kurt?
Yeah, I think that one path forward on this, I'm not necessarily optimistic that it will happen, would be to, and certainly what the international community would be looking for or might welcome, since that was the question, and react positively to. Because it'd be nicer for the international community not just to say, oh, this is awful, such and such is happening, such and such prosecution, but rather this was better. Would be a focus on violent crime. So there was violent activity in 2019. Probably the most number of incidents were by people wearing black t-shirts. There was a significant number of incidents by people wearing white t-shirts, and there was some police brutality. That's just kind of clear facts on the ground. I haven't seen yet a pattern of prosecuting violent acts as being the priority in terms of what the prosecutorial activity, and instead it seems to be focusing mainly on people who are politically significant and have political voice, which is a different and approach, different in a bad way, approach to trying to reorganize or deal with the justice aspects of cleaning up after 2019. So that it really, the approach that's being taken to prosecutions, particularly under the national security law, really feels more like a political clampdown than trying to prosecute people for having stepped over the line in terms of their individual actions as part of a protest movement.
Can I just make a clarification here? Many of the protesters are in terms of what they did in 2019, is of course not being prosecuted under the national security law. Those that are being prosecuted under the security law, the numbers are very small at the moment. There have been, of course, a number of arrests. And when you're thinking about things like collusion, then who are the people? Well, they happen to be the more significant people who could get to go and see significant people in the US. So what I'm saying is this is a difficult situation. We have to it is unsettling. We'll have to see how it goes. The national security law is there, and I hope people are going to be sensitive to going overseas to lobby for sanctions against Hong Kong and China, because that would just cause more collateral damage in Hong Kong itself.
Well, we have to stop at this point. Unfortunately, we cannot resolve everything this evening, but I thank both of our speakers very much, and I thank the audience for staying with us. I hope everybody has a healthy, safe, and happy holiday season and new year. I think we can agree that we want 2021 to be better than 2020 has been.
That's for sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.